Today, Great.com talks with Cosby Hunt, who is the Director of Youth Programming at the Center for Inspired Teaching. If you haven't heard of them, they are an organization transforming the school system by cultivating change-making educators who authentically engage their students as active listeners, as active learners, and empathetic critical thinkers. If you're new here to the podcast, please press subscribe on YouTube or in your podcast app, because today you are going to learn about not only some of the challenges that our education system is facing, but also what we can do to ensure that the next generation is set up for success. Cosby, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me. Happy summer.
Yeah. Very, very happy summer. We were talking offline. It is blistering hot here in Houston. I'm hoping that you're experiencing something a little bit better there in DC. But man, pleasure having you on the show. Thanks for doing this. This is great.
Well, I'm looking forward to the questions. I appreciate you, finding out about our organizations.
Of course. I'm still having a little bit of lag, so I'll apologize. We'll do our best to trim this together. But I think that, there we go. We've got it cleaned up. Talk to me a bit about the Center of Inspired Teaching. I mean, what is it? Talk to me about the goals, what you're working on, all that good stuff. Give me the overview.
Well, I'm going to take you back a little bit in history to our founder, Aletta Margolis, who founded the organization over 20 years ago. She came out of her undergraduate studies and found herself working with youth who'd been incarcerated. And she was teaching them, I believe it was a creative writing class or a performing arts class. And in her interaction with them, and these were all teenagers and people in their early 20s, I believe, she found them to just be insightful and engaged and creative. So she wondered, well, what happened to them in their educational lives and being incarcerated? And to a person, each one of them said something along the lines of boredom, or their teachers didn't get to know them. They didn't feel like they were part of a community. School didn't seem to matter. And I think that lit a fire in Aletta. And she said, well, keep people out of prison, make school a place that is good for everybody. It looks like we need to work with teachers. Mm-hmm. And so that was the beginning of an organization that was the Center for Artistry in Teaching at first. And that name, I think she came to realize that too many people, potential funders, thought that it had something to do with the arts. And so she had to sort of change direction on the name and came up with Center for Inspired Teaching, which, by the way, we call Inspired Teaching for short. And we do a lot of work around having teachers think about why they got into teaching in the first place, what their own personal educational philosophy is, how does that jibe with what they want students to get out of their own education. We do a considerable amount of improvisational theater work with our teachers. Not because, well, I'll say that all teachers are performers to a certain extent, but what we realized is that all teachers have to be improvisers. Mm. And we especially emphasize this idea of teachers should be facilitators, teaching people how to think, not what to think. So we're not so keen on memorization, but really, as I said, trying to get people to teachers to focus on teaching kids how to think. Mm.
Yeah, I love the mission, and even talking about the founding story understanding the group that she was speaking with, the group of incarcerated folks who can't connect with their feelings. I mean, I went to a public school. I think most, if not everyone that was enlisted or enrolled in some sort of public school system can feel like all of their years, most of their years, they were put in some sort of box, right? And it's like you're going through the same grading system and you're taking these mandatory tests and you're forced to memorize information. And then at the end of the quarter or at the end of the test, at the end of the year, you kind of pull that plug, you dump it, and you make room for the next one, right? And there's all these theories and ideas that you don't really connect with, and you don't understand why you're learning it, and you're just being forced and required to remember this. It's for the test. And I've watched many of your videos. I did watch many of the improv classes that the teachers are going through on your website. And it's a very unique approach. I do want to ask you about that in a second, but first I wanted to ask you sort of why you've been so inspired. I mean, if my homework does me right, you've been there almost or a little over 11-ish years. It makes you a unicorn in my book, right? I think most people like to hop from organization to organization every few years for a promotion or for a change of space, an environment change, yet you've really held strong. And I think that's typically because it's striking a chord a bit deeper than a title change or a pay bump. So I'm curious, why have you stuck around? What has you inspired?
That's a great question. No pun intended. At first, teaching for 15 years at that point, and wanted to stay in education. Thought that I had some ideas to share myself, but also wanted to see what are other people doing in their classrooms, because for the most part, we as teachers are in our own world all day. And whether our door is open or not, we're in our own world with our own classes all day. We're not really getting to see what our colleagues are doing. Mm. And after 15 years, I thought, well, I'm kind of curious to see what other people are doing. I haven't learned everything I need to know. And I've got some things that I think I can share with others. So there was some curiosity about what was going on with other folks. So I started working with teachers, as Inspired Teaching does. And then I realized that while it was great doing professional development, there would come a time, I hadn't gotten to it yet in the first 3 or 4 years of Inspired Teaching, but there would come a time when people would say, I would say, hey, well, when I used to teach 10 years ago, and then automatically people would just stop listening to me. Mm. Right? Because why would I listen to this guy who is no longer fighting the good fight? He's just some guy who used to teach. We used to complain about this in graduate school all the time. So then I started, Aletta allowed me to, I proposed to her that I would teach an after school class for kids from different high schools. You probably read about real world history, and that the class would be sort of a model of what we would like teachers to be doing in their own classrooms. And it would allow me to also keep my street cred so that I could stand in front of a group of teachers and say, hey, here's this thing that I did in my class last week. It might be useful to you. Give me some critique. Let's talk about it. And so in that way, I was still working with teachers, but I was also continuing to work with students. And I think that's a large reason why I've been able to stay inspired at Inspired Teaching, because I'm a practitioner and a professional developer. And in a shameless attempt to live forever, nobody remembers who their professional developer was, but kids remember who their high school teachers were. Mm. And, this is in some ways a shameless attempt to live forever in the hearts and minds of young people.
Yeah. And what a great idea. A light bulb moment to eat your own dog food. It's very, very different to, coming from an athletic background, many times, and you said this even as a student, many times you feel like you're superior, your coach, has been out of the game a while. Like, that's not how things go anymore. But people aren't doing that these days, right? Like, things have changed and you're out of the game. And so for you to, like you said, maintain that street cred and say, guys, this isn't a theory. This isn't something I came up with in a study last week. I actually deployed this in my classroom, and this is the impact it had. You've got to try this. It's a very, very different message. You talked about some of the problems earlier that we're experiencing in the education system, sort of the cookie cutter approach to educating, the siloed approach, even within schools. You don't understand what the other folks are doing that's successful or that's not, just kind of throwing it at the wall. I wanted to ask, what is Inspired Teaching doing that's different? I mean, first, are you working with students or are you working with teachers? Talk to me about your approach.
We're working with both. We'll talk first about sort of COVID. We have been meeting with teachers virtually. We've always had teacher institutes, usually in the summer. But now in COVID, our teacher institutes have happened about 4 times during the year. We meet here in the Zoom room. It's a challenge. We do a lot of physical movement in our institutes usually. And so we've had to incorporate some physical movements into what we're doing at the beginning of our institutes now, which is a little bit weird for people. And our teacher institutes this year have revolved, some of them have revolved around one of our youth programs, which is called Speak Truth. So Speak Truth is a program where we bring young people together twice a month to talk about issues of pertinence to them. And what makes the discussions different is that all discussions are student chosen and all the discussions are student led. So we prep the facilitators to be ready to talk about to lead the seminar. And then really as adults, we just let people into the Zoom room. We welcome people. We turn off our cameras. We mute ourselves and we're listening as the student facilitators take over. And so what we've done with our teacher institutes is now we've tried to engage teachers in how can you incorporate seminars like this into your own classrooms. You're probably very good at doing teacher-led discussions with your students. How can we get you to go to the next level where you're not doing the facilitating, one of your students is doing or one or more of your students are doing the facilitating. And so that's one example of at least what we've done in the last couple of years in our teacher institutes. And we have some workshops coming up this summer where we're going to be in person again and outside. And it's going to have a lot to do with rejuvenation for teachers. Not so much content focused, but rejuvenation. I mean, that's another thing I should say is that our teacher institutes have traditionally been not agnostic, but let's see. We've had everything from pre-K teachers through high school teachers. And so because the focus was really on philosophy and not so much you're coming to this because you're a chemistry teacher. You're coming to this because you're an educator and you want to think about how to reach your students regardless of what your content is.
That's what I was going to say. And, it's worth mentioning, just street cred purpose, founded in 95. You told us the founding story. If homework serves me right, it's founded in 95. Since then, more than 15,000 teachers have been ran through this program, which obviously just if you kind of draw the spider web out, 15,000 teachers, then the number of students they hit, it's hundreds of thousands of students, which is incredible. What could a student expect, or what is different, right? We're talking about that traditional school system, the traditional methodology of teaching, and you sitting in a desk from 7 a.m. to 4 p.m., you being taught 6 or 7 different subjects at once, it being very sort of cookie cutter. You learn this, then you learn this, and 6 weeks later you take a test. Here, you talked about there's lots of movement at the beginning of the class. You talked about this Speak Truth program, that it's student-led. This feels very different than that traditional system. Can you talk a bit, or maybe share some stories, some examples of things that inspired teachers do differently in the classroom?
Absolutely. Inspired teachers do a lot of relationship building. One of the things, and this doesn't come through in an audio podcast very well, but one of the first assignments that an inspired teacher might give is something called a profile page, where the students will take a piece of construction paper and they will put a picture of themselves on the construction paper. They'll write their nickname. They'll write how many people they have in their family. They'll write their favorite TV show. They'll write what they thought they were going to be when they were 5 years old, what they think they're going to be in their future now at age 17 or whatever age it is. And we do the same thing with teachers. And so by creating these profile pages, this is a way and then we share them with each other. You're beginning to build this relationship between people. Oh, look, here's somebody else who's a Sagittarius, or here's somebody else who doesn't like dogs, and trying to make some of those connections. It's not rocket science. But I do think that inspired teachers do more over the course of the year to continue building relationships. There are plenty of teachers who do some activity in the first week of school to get to know students. I think inspired teachers do a better job building off of that getting to know you stuff all year long. Because learning happens when people feel comfortable with each other. And when there is an academic challenge that isn't too hard, and isn't too easy. To use the technical term, zone of proximal development, I believe it's called. See, I'm out of practice as I enter my summer here, but there's something about the material being not too easy, not too hard, and that zone, I think, of proximal development. Yeah,
I think. I've heard about this and talked about this a lot on my own show of what it takes to get in the zone, right? And to be really to find flow state. And you could find that as a student or as a teenager. And really one of the biggest things to find flow state, and I've spoken to many of these attention management experts, is to find something that is just challenging enough to keep you from getting distracted, right? And I like that idea of getting them comfortable, but stimulating them enough to not get bored and to not wander off and not to jack around, but to give them material that's a bit more rigorous and engaging, and keeping them on their feet and keeping them interactive and having them lead the conversation and them come up with topics. It's a very, very different approach. It's a different approach. I'd like to know if it's a successful approach. I mentioned you founded in 95. You've been around, 25 plus years, 15,000 teachers, hundreds of thousands of students. Something is working, but do we have any data, any proof, whether that's legit numbers or stories, but is this a more effective method, right? For folks that have taken your course, do we have something that we can kind of hold on to as proof, or if we continue to use that term, street cred?
The answer is yes. And let me first say that the traditional way that we think about success in education is through test scores. And that is explicitly something that we de-emphasize in some ways at Inspired Teaching. But we do live in the real world, and we realize that scores matter to a certain extent. But I will say up front that it is challenging to show through test scores the success of students who've had inspired teachers. Can you draw a line between the relationship building, the improvisational approach of their teachers to the test scores of the students? Maybe, maybe not.
Sure.
I think, of course, one place to look is at the Inspired Teaching Demonstration School, the charter school here in Washington, and the success of those students. And whether it be, you could look at that success in where those students end up going to high school after they graduate from 8th grade. You could look at some test scores. I think another place to look is at the teachers themselves, looking at teachers who've been through our program. Let's say, for a long time, we had a teacher residency program. So teachers would be residents in the classrooms of veteran teachers, and then that would be how they launched their careers as educators. So they would spend a year as residents and then become first-year teachers themselves. I think you can look at where some of the teachers who've been through our teacher residency program have ended up. Some of them are now administrators. Some of them are just great teachers who are veterans themselves now. So there's a lot of anecdotal evidence, and there are some numbers that we could look at, but it's a challenge. That idea of how do you assess what success means in education?
Yeah, well, I love the idea of obviously, I'm totally on board with the idea that you first made of is success a higher test score when many folks, including myself, are not the best test takers, but I consume knowledge. I love learning, but sitting down and taking a 4-hour required test that you have to fill in a document and bubble in these answers, it's just not my format, right? So it's really tough to decide, are you more successful because your students tested higher, though that is one factor that I think if you zoomed out, people would look at. What would be more interesting, and I'm only spitballing, I'm making this up, shooting from the hip, but what would be more interesting is if at some point, you guys have been around long enough now that people have taken your course, many students have graduated and moved on. It would be really interesting to be able to circle back and touch some of these students that had teachers that had gone through your course, and just to see their relationships and how that impacted their course of life, and maybe that have them take some sort of survey, and we could have sort of the folks that didn't have an inspired teacher versus those that did, and see where they're at, at year 5, at year 10, at year 15, and just see, do you still have a relationship with your teacher? Where are you at in life? What's your job? Things like that. I think that'd be very interesting, because I think that the approach you're taking is successful. I think it's very thoughtful, but like you said, like many of these courses and teaching things, they're so hard to track. You can't pull up a graph that shows up and to the right and say, see, look, this is progressing.
Well, I'm pulling it up right now. We do have some of that data right now. Students who have taken my after-school class, Real World History, many of them now are in college or have graduated from college. The class is going into its 8th year. So again, we've got folks in college, we've got folks who graduated from college. I'll read you one example.
Please, that'd be great.
Wrote to still college. I can find it here. Let's see.
I told you I wasn't making the idea up, by the way. You're already over it. That's
let's see.
I can relate. Yeah, go ahead.
Ask me the next question, and then by the time I'm done with that one, I'll have found this thing.
Well, I was going to say, I can relate just to the lack of proving value. At my 9 to 5, we are an assessment program. Like, we look at people's environments, and if something scary happens, we call them. But if nothing scary happens, we don't call them. And so at times we'll onboard a customer and nothing scary happens for 12 months. And if nothing scary happens, we don't call them. And 12 months later, they're calling us and saying, guys, you're not doing anything for us. What's happening? We say, well, there's been no reason to call you. And so the having to find ways to prove value or get creative is very interesting in the different sort of avenues. I saw you lean back. Did you find it for me?
I found it.
Oh, let's hear it. I'm excited to hear it.
So this student went on from high school to the University of Chicago, where she majored in sociology. And the thing to know about her is that in real world history, we spend a whole semester looking at the Great Migration, that movement of Black folks from the Jim Crow South to the North and the West during most of the 20th century. So this is what she wrote. I've been meaning to get in touch with you for a few months to let you know how helpful real world history has been for me in college. I'm a sociology major, and I take a lot of classes related to urban social problems. And having an understanding of the Great Migration is so crucial for understanding racial inequality in American cities today, especially in Chicago. Plus, I've had to do a couple of oral history interviews for classes, and having that interview experience in your class has been very helpful. So yeah, just wanted to give a belated thanks for that. Now, I'll tell you that you get one of those kind of emails once every 5 years, that keeps you in the game.
100%.
One of the exciting things that we emphasize at Inspired Teaching is student as expert. That's sort of one of the pillars of our approach. And that email is a good example of the good things that can happen with young people when you do a deep dive into a topic with them. You never know, I didn't know she was going to end up at the University of Chicago, but there she was in one of the hotbeds of the Great Migration, right? Like one of the main receiving cities. And having done an oral history interview with a Black Washingtonian who'd moved to Washington from the South, when she got to Chicago, having studied the Great Migration, she was able to make those connections. And in that way, especially because she was doing the real history of conducting an oral history interview, she was doing the work of a student as expert. And I Inspired Teachers do a great job of putting students in that position. And in order to do that, you have to do what you need to as an instructor to become expert in not being a sage on the stage, but being a facilitator.
As you're telling that story, I'm kind of thinking, like, have I had teachers that, the approach that you're talking about, you're going above and beyond. And if I had a teacher that I've had to write an email back to, and as you're telling that and you're reading your email off, I'm thinking back, I definitely have. My sophomore, junior year of college, I had this professor of accounting, and we were getting ready for my final, my sophomore year. And I was freaking out. There's a question I could not figure out. The finals are very limited. There's like 4 questions. So if you can't get one, you're like, oh, I'm already going to get a 75. So I emailed her at like 11 o'clock at night. And I played football for a small school in Kansas. It's Division II, so it was really tiny. The classroom was like less than 30 people. We may have had like 20, 24 people in the class. So I emailed her late at night, 10, 11 o'clock, and said, ma'am, I cannot wrap my mind around this. I need some help. Can you write it down on a sheet of paper? Do something for me. And she ended up FaceTiming me. at like 11 o'clock, pulled me up on Zoom or whatever it was on my computer and walked me through the problem at 11 p.m. And I was blown away that this teacher jumped on Zoom. She had cats, things in the background, and she's willing to help me through this. And I'm not paying her for this or anything like that. And at the end, I was overwhelmed with just gratitude. And, I cannot believe that you did this. And she said, listen, you should always reach out. You should always ask questions. Never let that fear pull you back. You should. And I'm very confident that if that's not the driver of me starting my podcast and me asking these questions and wanting to learn more, it played a heavy, heavy hand. And so I think you're right that there are things that a teacher, a leader, a mentor can do. Something as small as that. She answered one call for me and said, I'll answer this for you right now. And because of that, it could ripple into different decisions and roles and impact. It could really turn into something great for that kid, for that student. And I guess I'm just continuing to echo. I love this the thoughtful approach that you guys are taking to this. I want to ask, let's say someone in the education system has come across this podcast. They're listening. This is exactly what I've been thinking. I've been banging these symbols together, doing this cookie cutter method. I didn't know there was another approach out there, but I love this. How could someone how could someone learn more? How could they become a part of this course, become part of this on-site program you're talking about? How could someone be more involved?
Well, obviously, I'm glad that you asked that. And let me say that oftentimes when we have our in-person 2-week institutes, on the second or third day, there are always a number of teachers who, when we're having a discussion or there's some kind of share out, there'll be, or we do some journaling too, and someone's reading from their journal, someone will basically say what you just said in a different set of words, that they didn't realize that there were other people who shared their philosophy of education. So let me say first that, our approach focuses on what we call the 4 I's: intellect, inquiry, imagination, and integrity. So if you're an educator who hangs their hat on one of those ideas, you should definitely contact us. Intellect, inquiry, imagination, integrity. A lot of what we've talked about today, I've mentioned one of the pillars of our approach being student as expert. You and I have talked about one of the other pillars, mutual respect. That's building of the relationships. Wide-ranging evidence of student learning. I think we touched a little bit on that when I read the email. Your story about contacting your professor and that conversation that you had with your professor at 11 o'clock at night reminds me of another one of our pillars: purpose, persistence, and action. And then the last one is joy. So if someone's listening and they want to make joy, mutual respect, student as expert, purpose, persistence, and action, or wide-ranging evidence of student learning more a part of their approach to education, they should definitely contact us. The website's very easy. You can Google Center for Inspired Teaching. You can just go to inspiredteaching.org, and we will find a way to work with you in person or remotely. One of the great things, maybe the blessings out of this crazy last 2 years is that we've had to figure out how to reach more people, even people in our own city who we would normally be working with in person. We've been working with remotely. So now we've got more teachers because we've been in the Zoom room. Now we've been working with teachers in other countries just because, hey, look, everybody's at home. So let's open it up to all kinds of folks.
Love it. How about the parents or just fans of this conversation? So this mission makes so much sense. We've got to deploy resources. We got to support this. Do you have those same resources? Your website, is that the best place for those folks as well?
Yes, and one of the things that you'll find I think we're still working on it. It may be ready now. Is we have a guidebook for people who want to have some of those student-led discussions that we talked about earlier. And I think when you go to youth programs on our website and you click Speak Truth, if it's not up already, it will be soon, a guidebook for anyone who's trying to make student-led discussions happen in their classrooms, or I suppose at your own dinner table at home. And obviously, parents in Washington, D.C. should think about consider enrolling their students at the Inspired Teaching Demonstration School also.
Yeah. Cosby, I'm a believer and a really big fan of what you have going on. Man, I'm very thankful for you coming on the show, but as someone that I was very impacted, enjoyed, and think about the relationship that I had with my teachers, with my coaches and mentors. Often I went to school to be a coach because of how impacted I was by my coaches and teachers. Hearing your approach, the successes, the email that you read off, I love what y'all have going on. But I say all that to say I really appreciate your time and thank you for doing this.
Thank you. I enjoyed the conversation.
Yeah. For those that are listening, if you enjoyed this episode, please press subscribe on YouTube or the podcast app. This will show the algorithm that this is an important conversation so more people can learn about the importance of staying involved and how each of you can become the leverage point for change.